Hello, and welcome to Nano Studio. I'm your host, Tyler. Today we're going to continue working on the 11 by 14 encaustic piece that we started last time that I have lovingly decided to call Pizza Brook, in reference to Pizza the dog and the brook that it is a landscape of. So with that, why don't we just go ahead and jump right into this one. So we are going to start by adding some encaustic paint to this piece at this point. We are going to primarily have a green palette, pretty monochromatic, with just a little bit of sort of yellows and golds to sort of warm things up. But primarily we're working in a monochromatic green tone here. And we're actually going to start with the green that we started with back in the first series of videos that I did, that being an earth green. Now that we've had a little bit of experience with it and kind of know how it's going to react, we're going to go ahead and implement it in this piece. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of that without much encaustic medium to thin it out. I really want to have a pretty heavy saturation going on here at this point. So we're going to build that out just a little bit and add just a little bit of kind of a little gold to it, just to warm things up and soften things as we go. So just those kind of little elements in play here as we start to build a lot of, say, the foliage and whatnot that we're going to be putting into this piece. It is going to be a fairly structured landscape, but still a bit on the abstract side, but really trying to capture sort of a late spring, early morning sort of feel, kind of hazy, not bright, but very popping with a lot of greenery and plant life. So here we are in just a little bit of gold tone to it. Really the only other main color that we're going to be using in this piece, just to add sort of that like early morning glow, sort of warm tone that we have, especially going on with that sort of olive tone green underneath there as well. And now we're going to do just a little bit of fusion to this, just to move things around just a little bit. And as we're doing this, you're going to notice that obviously none of that under layer is moving because we have a nice clear coat of encaustic medium that we put down in the last video. So that is nice and protected from any heat and movement that we're going to be adding to this little bit of encaustic layer that we just put on top. And while we're doing this, I thought I would point out that in yesterday's video there was a question about substrates and about gessoing them. And it's something I have talked about a little bit before, but I figured we could go in a little bit more detail today. All the substrates that we've been using so far have been of the Ampersand Gessobord line, a board that I use a lot. I found that it is probably one of the better ones out there, and I've just never had any issues with it. The Ampersand line also does do an encaustic board. The biggest differences between the Gessobord and the encaustic board is the encaustic board is about a 1/4 inch thick, while the Gessobord is about an 1/8 inch thick. And technically the encaustic board has a heat-resistant gesso to it, but to be honest, I've had no issues with the gesso on just the Gessobord. So either board, I say, are great starters when using encaustic. You don't have to do any more gesso layers to them or anything like that. They are just good to go. You can put really anything on them, and they work great. That being said, not all gesso boards are created equal. I've had major issues with masterpiece boards and other ones like that where the gesso layers are just so thin that once you start to apply heat, those layers can honestly just peel right off the substrate. So if I ever am using a masterpiece board or really any other kind of board that's not Ampersand, I tend to actually do gesso those myself, just to have a better layer, because the other ones tend to be so thin. There's actually a lot of grit, a lot of texture, and those actually do get affected by the heat. So when using those, I do actually gesso those. But you don't have to gesso boards at all if you don't want to. I sometimes do use just straight, open, just plank wood sometimes and work encaustic over that. Only thing I have to keep in mind is you do want a good layer of encaustic medium down first, because that wood will kind of suck and absorb some of that wax first. So if you want a good substrate to work with, you're not really gessoing it, but you are kind of priming it with the encaustic medium instead. Another substrate you can use pretty easily is plexiglass. The bigger it is, sometimes it can warp a little bit due to the heat, but overall, any plexi I've used tends to actually retain its shape once it's cooled down a little bit. So if you use anything smaller than an 11 by 14, doesn't tend to warp. If you go for a 16 by 20, you might have some weird bubbling happening once you heat that plexi, but most of the time it seems to settle back down once it cools. And with that, you can gesso it. You don't have to gesso it. That one is a very interesting substrate to use, partly because you can actually use the transparency and actually start painting on both sides of the plexi too. But so that's a little bit of information on substrates. So if you see here, I kind of forgot to capture the application of this little bit of paint layer here. So I'm sorry it didn't quite capture, but I just put on just a little layer, more of that green, and actually a little bit of black too. Which generally, unless I'm working in any black and white piece, I don't tend to use straight black, partly because blacks you don't really find in nature, and two, they are so harsh that it really can draw a lot of attention to, which is exactly why I'm using it this time. I do want it to be that stark, that harsh, and to be kind of the focal point that we're going to be building off of. So normally, especially in landscapes and pieces that showcase nature, black tends to be pretty frowned upon when being used, again, because it's not really a color that's found traditionally in nature. So it can be a little shocking to see that in a more natural setting. But we're going to be heavily obscuring a bit of this black as well, so that will help tone it back down, but we'll still make it a pretty vibrant center point that we're going to be working from. And so just doing a little bit of firing to this, because we're really wanting to get a lot of texture and movement happening in the little layers that we're doing. We want to see a lot of the sort of lines and stretching that the pigmentation can do in the encaustic. All this little bit of texture and movement that we can get is really trying to replicate the idea of foliage and grasses and just the way that nature sort of pops and moves. So that's why we're doing a lot of like little layers here and there that we're then pushing to other points, because we really want to get that sort of natural overgrown sort of movement happening. That looks pretty nice. Definitely still have a lot of layers to cover up here before we really start to see any sort of composition building. But right now we're really trying to build in the texture and kind of the outline to part of the composition anyway. So slowly building little bits and pieces here. It's going to take a while for this piece to really look like it's building to a landscape, but it will get there. And it's just always so nice to touch encaustics. It just feels so nice, so soft, especially once you fire it. Always see me handling the artwork quite a bit. And now we're just trying to kind of brush up some edges, just so that when you put more layers on top of these, they're not going to interact weirdly. Sometimes you can get some odd bumping and movement if there's too much of an edge on one layer once you put another layer over top of that. So to mitigate that, I really try and soften a lot of the edges of especially these lower layers, just so they feel a lot flatter, and there's less. Because once you start building layers, more and more of those little imperfections will start to create other little, not necessarily issues, but points of texture or drama or a bump or movement, and that will just get multiplied based on how many more layers get on top of that. So the smoother the base, the smoother everything else. Now we're just peeling back a little bit of this background element here, just again to have that more stark white element going on that really reads as the background. And that is all for today. Let me know what you think of how this piece is going and where you think it's going down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you would like to see more like it, please subscribe to Nameless Studio. As always, I've been Tyler, and until next time, be seeing you.